shadows among the Persian tiles. It was 6 o'clock in the morning when Mr. Parker Pyne, famed solver of human dilemmas, embarked on yet another adventure, this time exploring the mysteries of Persia. After a brief stop in Baghdad, the little monoplane was ready to carry him further into the heart of the ancient land. But the cramped confines of the aircraft left much to be desired for the robust Mr. Parker Pyne, whose comfort was thoroughly compromised by the narrow seats. Joining him on this journey were two peculiar companions, a large, florid man who seemed the very embodiment of idle chatter, and a thin, sharp-faced woman with pursed lips and an air of unyielding determination. As Mr. Parker Pyne sized them up, he thought, with no small relief, "At least they don't look like the type to seek my professional advice." Indeed, they did not. The woman, it turned out, was an American missionary, her life a testament to hard work and unshakable happiness. The man, on the other hand, was an employee of an oil company, his tales flowing freely as they waited for the plane to take off. Mr. Parker Pyne introduced himself modestly, declaring, "I am merely a tourist, I'm afraid." He added, with a touch of delight, "I'm visiting Tehran, Isfahan, and Shiraz." The sheer lyrical beauty of the names enchanted him so much that he repeated them aloud, savoring each syllable. "Tehran, Isfahan, Shiraz," he murmured, lost in the music of the words. As the plane soared over the flat desert below, Mr. Parker Pyne felt a sense of awe. The vast, uninhabited expanse whispered of ancient mysteries and untold stories. At Kermanshah, the plane descended for passport examinations and customs inspections. A small cardboard box in Mr. Parker Pyne's luggage drew undue attention, leading to a flurry of questions in Persian. Unfortunately, Mr. Parker Pyne's knowledge of the language was non-existent. Enter the pilot, a fair-haired young German with piercing blue eyes and a face weathered by years of flying. He approached with an easy smile, asking, "Please, may I help?" "It's bug powder," Mr. Parker Pyne explained, his tone exasperated yet hopeful. "Could you possibly convey that to them?" The pilot grinned, translating the words into Persian. The solemn officials' faces brightened, their laughter breaking the tension. Relieved, Mr. Parker Pyne resumed his seat as the flight continued. At Hamadan, the plane briefly swooped low to deliver mail, but did not stop. Mr. Parker Pyne strained to catch a glimpse of the famous Rock of Behistun, where the ancient Persian king Darius had immortalized his conquests in 3 languages. By the time the plane reached Tehran at 1 p.m., Mr. Parker Pyne was more than ready for a change of scenery. However, Tehran proved a disappointment. To Mr. Parker Pyne's dismay, the city was distressingly modern, lacking the charm and mystique he had anticipated. That evening, as he entered his hotel, he spotted the German pilot and, on an impulse, invited him to dinner. Over a meal that concluded with sticky chocolate confections and thick cups of sweet coffee, the two men conversed. "You go to Shiraz next?" asked the pilot. "Yes," replied Mr. Parker Pyne. "I plan to fly there, then return by road through Isfahan and Tehran." The pilot shook his head. "Not me. I return to Baghdad tomorrow, but you must be careful. Shiraz is a place of beauty and secrets." As they talked, the pilot grew reflective. "Do you know," he said, "my first passengers were 2 English ladies. One of them was very young, very well born, Lady Esther Carr. A minister's daughter, they said. She was beautiful, but—" He hesitated. "But what?" prompted Mr. Parker Pyne. "Mad," the pilot declared bluntly. "Completely mad. She lives in Shiraz now, in a great house surrounded by lush gardens. They say she wears Eastern dress and refuses to see Europeans. A strange life for a lady of her upbringing, wouldn't you agree?" Intrigued, Mr. Parker Pyne felt a familiar stir of curiosity. Who was Lady Esther Carr? Why had she abandoned her English roots for the mysterious allure of Shiraz? What secrets lay hidden within the walls of her house? As the pilot bid him good night, Mr. Parker Pyne knew one thing for certain. Shiraz held more than the promise of beauty. It held a mystery, one that he, Parker Pyne, could not resist unraveling. And so, with anticipation coursing through him, he prepared for the next leg of his journey, unaware of the shadows awaiting him in the heart of Persia. Imagine standing at the edge of a mystery, where the air is thick with secrets, and every word drips with intrigue. Mr. Parker Pyne was about to step into just such a story. It all began with a chance conversation, a pilot with piercing blue eyes and a rugged charm recounting a tale of two Englishwomen in Shiraz. One of them, Lady Esther Carr, had descended into madness, abandoning her life for an isolated existence in a house draped in vibrant blue, rose, and yellow tiles. The other woman? Dead under suspicious circumstances. She was a flower, the pilot had whispered, his voice tinged with melancholy. But the other one, mad, completely mad, maybe she killed her. Those words lingered, haunting Mr. Parker Pyne as he gazed upon Shiraz from the skies, a lush emerald oasis cradled by barren, unforgiving mountains. The city was alive with the colors and chaos of the Nowruz festival, the Persian New Year. But Parker Pyne's mind was already elsewhere. He had seen the house. Nestled in a green garden bursting with orange trees, roses, and sparkling water, it called to him. It wasn't just a house. It was a dream, trapped in stone and tile. A place too beautiful to hold darkness. Yet the whispers of tragedy made it impossible to see it as anything but sinister. That evening, over dinner with the English consul, Parker Pyne leaned in. "What's the story with that house?" The consul chuckled. "Ah, the house at Shiraz. Fascinating, isn't it? Built by a governor who lined his pockets well. His legacy, you could say. But now it belongs to Lady Esther Carr." "And?" Parker Pyne prodded. "She's mad as a hatter. 30 years old, but you'd think she's ancient the way she's buried herself in that house. Won't see anyone British. Dresses like the locals. Lives like them, too." "And the other Englishwoman?" Parker Pyne's voice lowered, cutting through the consul's rambling. The consul hesitated. "Died about 3 years ago. Fell from a balcony while carrying a breakfast tray. Cracked her skull on the stone below. Tragic, but accidents happen." Parker Pyne's mind raced. A young, vibrant woman leaving her world behind. Another woman dead in a supposedly accidental fall. A pilot's wistful memories tinged with suspicion. This wasn't just a story. It was an enigma wrapped in shadow, and Parker Pyne couldn't resist unraveling it. That night, as the stars lit the Persian sky, Mr. Parker Pyne made a decision. He would uncover the truth behind the house at Shiraz. Because, as he well knew, in every whispered tale of madness and tragedy, there was always more than met the eye. This wasn't just a house. It was the heart of a story waiting to be told. And Parker Pyne was ready to step inside. In the fading glow of dusk, the gardens of the house at Shiraz seemed to hold their breath. Mr. Parker Pyne, ever the observer of human nature, found himself walking through this enigmatic paradise. The scent of orange blossoms mingled with the faint chill of the evening air, as a Persian servant led him up an outside staircase to the back of the house. The door creaked open, revealing a courtyard bathed in moonlight. At the center of it all reclined a figure that could only be described as regal. Lady Esther Carr, draped in flowing Eastern robes that accentuated her striking, almost otherworldly beauty, sat on a grand divan. Her posture was commanding, her chin tilted upward, her dark eyes glinting with a mixture of arrogance and curiosity. "Ah, Mr. Parker Pyne," she said, her voice low and velvety, though carrying a tone that suggested she was accustomed to being obeyed. "Sit there." Her slender hand gestured toward a pile of cushions on the floor. On her finger, an enormous emerald ring glinted in the lamplight, carved with the crest of her family, a piece of history and wealth, worn with the confidence of someone who understood its value. Parker Pyne, a man of practical build and less than practical knees, lowered himself onto the cushions with as much dignity as he could muster. He accepted a cup of coffee from the silent servant, sipping it slowly, savoring the rich aroma. Lady Esther, too, held her coffee, her eyes half closed, giving the impression of infinite leisure. For a moment, they sat in silence. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension, like a chessboard before the first move. Finally, she spoke, her tone clipped, almost accusatory. "So, you help unhappy people," she said, her lips curling slightly in disdain. "At least, that is what your advertisement claims." Parker Pyne met her gaze evenly. "Yes," he replied. Her dark brows arched. "Why?" "Why do I help people?" he asked, genuinely intrigued. "Because it's what I do. It's my profession." "No," she interrupted, leaning forward, the emerald catching the light again. "Why did you send it to me? Was it some tactic? Your way of drumming up business in foreign lands?" Her voice had turned sharper, almost mocking. But Parker Pyne, unflappable as always, smiled gently and shook his head. "No," he said, "I'm on holiday. Business was the last thing on my mind." "Then why?" she pressed. "Because I had reason to believe," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "that you are unhappy." For a brief moment, the imperious Lady Esther Carr seemed to falter. A flicker of something, anger, sadness, or perhaps fear, crossed her face. But she recovered quickly, setting down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. "Unhappy?" she repeated, her tone icy. "What makes you think that?" Parker Pyne leaned back slightly, observing her with the practiced eye of a man who had seen every shade of human misery. "It's not so much what I think," he said. "It's what I sense. People who are content don't isolate themselves in houses like this, far from everyone they've ever known. They don't live surrounded by beauty while radiating pain." She laughed then, a sharp, bitter sound. "You presume a great deal, Mr. Parker Pyne." "Perhaps," he said, unfazed, "but I'm rarely wrong." Lady Esther's eyes narrowed, her fingers playing absently with the edge of her robe. "You speak of unhappiness as though it's a condition that can be cured." "Some sorrows," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "cannot be healed. They are etched into the soul." Parker Pyne leaned forward, his expression softening. "Perhaps," he said, "but sometimes they can be understood, and in understanding there is relief." She looked away, her gaze fixed on the courtyard's shadowed corners. For the first time, her imperious mask seemed to slip, revealing a glimpse of the woman beneath. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, almost contemplative. Parker Pyne met her gaze evenly. "Yes," he replied. Her dark brows arched. "Why?" "Why do I help people?" he asked, genuinely intrigued. "Because it's what I do. It's my profession." "No," she interrupted, leaning forward, the emerald catching the light again. "Why did you send it to me? Was it some tactic? Your way of drumming up business in foreign lands?" Her voice had turned sharper, almost mocking. But Parker Pyne, unflappable as always, smiled gently and shook his head. "No," he said, "I'm on holiday. Business was the last thing on my mind." "Then why?" she pressed. "Because I had reason to believe," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "that you are unhappy." For a brief moment, the imperious Lady Esther Carr seemed to falter. A flicker of something, anger, sadness or perhaps fear crossed her face. But she recovered quickly, setting down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. "Unhappy?" she repeated, her tone icy. "What makes you think that?" Parker Pyne leaned back slightly, observing her with the practiced eye of a man who had seen every shade of human misery. "It's not so much what I think," he said. "It's what I sense. People who are content don't isolate themselves in houses like this, far from everyone they've ever known. They don't live surrounded by beauty while radiating pain." She laughed then, a sharp, bitter sound. "You presume a great deal, Mr. Parker Pyne." "Perhaps," he said, unfazed, "but I'm rarely wrong." Lady Esther's eyes narrowed, her fingers playing absently with the edge of her robe. "You speak of unhappiness as though it's a condition that can be cured." "Some sorrows," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "cannot be healed. They are etched into the soul." Parker Pyne leaned forward, his expression softening. "Perhaps," he said, "but sometimes they can be understood, and in understanding there is relief." She looked away, her gaze fixed on the courtyard's shadowed corners. For the first time, her imperious mask seemed to slip, revealing a glimpse of the woman beneath. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, almost contemplative. He spoke of society's latest gossip, the fashion houses of Paris, and the small, unassuming shops tucked away in London's alleys, where treasures awaited the sharp-eyed. He talked of restaurants and race meetings, the thrill of the theater, and the scandals that whispered through grand country houses. His words flowed effortlessly, creating a tapestry of life back home. He ended with a homely image of London evenings, the trams and buses, the tired but contented crowds heading home to their modest, warm abodes. As he spoke, Lady Esther's proud posture softened. The haughty tilt of her chin dropped. Her imperious mask began to crack. Silent tears slid down her cheeks. She made no effort to stop them, nor to hide them. When Parker Pyne finally fell silent, she abandoned all pretense. Her shoulders shook as she sobbed openly, a sound raw with the weight of unspoken grief. Parker Pyne remained quiet, his gaze steady and unyielding. His face bore the look of a man who had played his hand perfectly and achieved the desired result. At last, Lady Esther raised her head. Her tear-streaked face was defiant, but her voice was bitter. "Well," she demanded, "are you satisfied now?" "I think so," Parker Pyne replied, his tone soft. "How am I supposed to bear it?" she cried suddenly, her voice breaking. "How shall I bear it, never leaving here, never seeing anyone again?" The words came as though they had been torn from her soul. She flushed, suddenly angry at her own outburst. "Well?" she demanded again, her voice hardening. "Aren't you going to say it? Aren't you going to make the obvious remark? If you want to go home so much, why not do so?" Parker Pyne shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "It's not nearly so simple, not for you." Something in his tone made her freeze. A flicker of fear passed through her eyes. "Do you know why I can't go back?" "I think so," Parker Pyne said evenly. "You're wrong," she snapped. "You couldn't possibly guess." "I don't guess," Parker Pyne said, his voice calm, unshaken. "I observe, and I classify." She shook her head vehemently. "You don't know anything at all. I'll have to convince you." "I see," Parker Pyne said, a trace of amusement in his voice. "When I came here," Lady Esther began, her voice low, "I flew." "By the new German air service from Baghdad." "Yes," Parker Pyne said, his gaze unwavering. "You were flown by a young pilot, H. Shell, and afterward he came here to see you." "Yes." The word was softer this time, hesitant, almost vulnerable. "And," Parker Pyne continued, you had a companion. A friend, perhaps. Her voice turned to steel. My companion. Her name was Muriel King. Did you care for her? What do you mean, care for her? She snapped. Her face twisted, but she caught herself. Her voice shifted colder now. She was useful to me. And when she died? Parker Pyne asked, his voice gentle but probing. Her composure cracked. Naturally, she began angrily, but then her voice faltered. She clenched her hands, glaring at him. Really, Mr. Parker Pyne, is it necessary to drag all of this up? She was trembling now, her facade of control crumbling. Parker Pyne watched her carefully, his face calm and impassive, as though he already knew the truth she was too terrified to admit. Lady Esther's voice cracked with irritation. I think I've indulged you enough, Mr. Parker Pyne. If you'll kindly tell me what I owe you. But Parker Pyne didn't budge. He sat, calm and immovable, showing no signs of offense. Instead, he pressed on, his questions as deliberate as his demeanor. Since Muriel King died, Hercule hasn't been to see you, has he? Her eyes flashed with a hint of something unspoken. No, she said curtly. And if he were to come, would you receive him? Certainly not. You'd refuse him absolutely. Absolutely, she snapped, her tone frosty. Hercule will not be admitted. Parker Pyne leaned back thoughtfully, as though contemplating a chessboard of possibilities. Yes, he murmured. You couldn't very well say anything else. Her composure faltered for a brief moment. She shifted uncomfortably, then said, almost uncertainly, I don't know what you mean. Parker Pyne's gaze didn't waver. Did you know, Lady Esther, that young Hercule was in love with Muriel King? The color drained from her face. She stiffened, but her voice, now softer, betrayed her. He was. Yes, Parker Pyne continued. He's a sentimental young man. Even now, he treasures her memory. Does he? Her voice was barely above a whisper now. What was she like? Parker Pyne asked. What do you mean? What was she like? Her words were clipped, defensive. How would I know? You must have looked at her sometimes, Parker Pyne said mildly. Oh, that. Her gaze flickered, unfocused. She was pleasant enough. A nice-looking young woman, I suppose, about my age, just about. There was a pause, and then her voice sharpened again. Why do you think Hercule cared for her? Because he told me so, Parker Pyne said simply, in the most unmistakable terms. He was quite distressed when she died, very distressed. Lady Esther shot to her feet, trembling with anger. Do you believe I murdered her? Parker Pyne didn't flinch. He wasn't the sort of man to leap to his feet in dramatic response. Instead, he looked up at her with a calm, fatherly expression. No, my dear child, he said gently. I don't believe you murdered her. And that being the case, I think the sooner you stop this performance and go home, the better. Her eyes blazed with fury. Performance? What on earth are you talking about? Parker Pyne folded his hands, his voice steady but piercing. The truth is, you lost your nerve. Badly. You thought you'd be accused of murdering your employer. Lady Esther froze, her face pale as chalk. Parker Pyne pressed on. You're not Lady Esther Carr. I knew that before I came here. But I've been testing my theory, and now I'm certain. A sly smile crept across his face, benign yet knowing. When I described London to you earlier, the cinemas, the cheap shops, the garden suburbs, you reacted. Every word struck a chord. But when I mentioned country house gossip, new nightclubs, Mayfair chatter, you were utterly indifferent. None of it meant anything to you. He leaned forward, his voice softening, becoming almost paternal. Sit down and tell me the truth, Muriel King. You didn't murder Lady Esther, but you believed you might be accused of doing so. Now, let's start from the beginning. Tell me how it all came about." Her shoulders slumped, and the proud facade crumbled at last. She sank onto the divan, covering her face with trembling hands. When she spoke, her words tumbled out in hurried bursts, each sentence a confession. I have to start from the beginning," she stammered. "I was afraid of her. She wasn't mad, not quite, but she was strange, a little unhinged. She brought me out here with her. Like a fool, I thought it was romantic, so exciting. I was just a silly little fool." She took a shaky breath, her hands twisting in her lap. "There was some business with a chauffeur back in England. She was man-mad, you see, obsessed. But he wouldn't have anything to do with her, and it humiliated her. People found out. They laughed at her behind her back. That's why she left. To save face." Muriel's voice dropped, trembling with the weight of her memories. This whole act, solitude in the desert, the grand retreat, she only meant to keep it up for a while. Then she'd go back, reclaim her dignity, but she got worse. She was different out here, wilder. And then there was the pilot. She trailed off, her face stricken. "Hercule," Parker Pyne prompted. "Yes." Her voice was barely audible. She fixated on him, and when he came here, he came to see me, not her. She thought. She paused, swallowing hard. Well, you could imagine what she thought. And then Muriel looked down, her voice breaking. She turned on me. She said I'd never leave, that I was her slave. Her slave, she called me. She said she had the power of life and death over me. Parker Pyne nodded slowly, seeing the picture come into focus. Lady Esther, spiraling into delusion, wielding her imagined power over a young, terrified girl. But one day, Muriel continued, her voice trembling with emotion, something in me snapped. I stood up to her. I told her I was stronger than she was. I said I'd throw her off the edge of the terrace if she didn't leave me alone. Her eyes filled with tears. She was frightened. Really frightened. I'd always been so meek, so quiet. I think she thought I meant it. Muriel's voice cracked as she whispered the final words. She stepped back too far, and then she was gone. She buried her face in her hands, her body racked with sobs. Parker Pyne sat silently for a moment, letting the storm of her confession pass. Then he spoke, his voice calm, soothing. "You didn't murder her, Muriel. You've been carrying this guilt, this fear, for too long. It's time to let it go. Time to go home." Muriel looked up at him, her tear-streaked face full of disbelief. For the first time, hope flickered in her eyes. Lady Esther's voice trembled with frustration, a crack of irritation seeping through the carefully maintained calm. "I think I've indulged you enough, Mr. Parker Pyne. If you'd kindly tell me what I owe you." Parker Pyne remained still, unfazed, his composed demeanor giving nothing away. He didn't react to her sharp tone. Instead, he pressed on, his questions deliberate, each one falling like a stone into still water, creating ripples of tension. "Since Muriel King's death, Hercule hasn't come to see you, has he?" A flicker of something unspoken, darted through Lady Esther's eyes. "No," she replied, the word clipped, as if she'd already sealed off that chapter of her life. "And if he were to come?" Pyne's voice was like velvet, smooth but cutting. "Would you receive him?" "Certainly not." "You'd refuse him, absolutely?" "Absolutely," Lady Esther snapped, her voice cold and brittle. "Hercule will not be admitted." Pyne leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled thoughtfully. "Yes," he murmured, almost to himself. "You couldn't very well say anything else. a subtle shift in her posture, a slight crack in her icy exterior. I don't know what you mean," she stammered, a rare flicker of uncertainty clouding her composure. Pine's gaze pierced her, unwavering, relentless. "Did you know, Lady Esther, that young Hercule was in love with Muriel King?" Her face blanched, the blood draining from her cheeks as if he'd struck a blow. Her gaze hardened instantly, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "He was?" "Yes," Pine continued, his voice a soft but unyielding drumbeat. "He's a sentimental young man. Even now, he treasures her memory." "Does he?" Her words were barely a whisper, trembling with a mix of disbelief and something else, perhaps fear. Pine pressed on, his tone casual, as though speaking of nothing more than the weather. "What was she like?" Lady Esther's eyes narrowed, defensive. "What do you mean, what was she like?" She spat, irritation seeping back into her voice. "How would I know?" "You must have looked at her sometimes," Pine suggested mildly, not backing down. Lady Esther's eyes flickered briefly, as if her mind had wandered to a memory she didn't wish to revisit. "Oh, that," she muttered dismissively. "She was pleasant enough. A nice-looking young woman, I suppose, just about my age." There was a pause, thick with tension. Then her voice grew sharp again, brittle. "Why do you think Hercule cared for her?" Pine's voice was a quiet declaration of truth. "Because he told me so, in no uncertain terms. He was distraught when she died, utterly devastated." Lady Esther shot up, her chair scraping violently against the floor. "Do you believe I murdered her?" she demanded, her words like daggers. Pine didn't flinch. He didn't leap to his feet or react with drama. He simply met her gaze with a calm, fatherly stare. "No, my dear Lady Esther, I don't believe you murdered her," he said, his voice gentle, almost patronizing. "But I do believe you've been performing a little act. And I think it's time to stop." "Performance?" Lady Esther echoed, her voice rising in fury. "What are you talking about?" Pine's voice remained steady, his gaze cutting through her defenses. "The truth, Lady Esther, is that you've lost your nerve. You were afraid you'd be accused of murdering your employer." The color drained from her face. Her breath caught. Pine leaned forward, his voice now a soft, almost intimate whisper. "But the thing is, you're not Lady Esther Carr. I knew that the moment I arrived. I've been testing a theory, and now I'm sure." A small, knowing smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "When I mentioned London earlier, cinemas, cheap shops, garden suburbs, you reacted. Every word struck a chord. But when I spoke of country house gossip, nightclubs, Mayfair chatter, you couldn't care less. It didn't resonate with you." He leaned in closer, his voice taking on a more paternal tone. "Sit down, Muriel King. It's time to tell me the truth. You didn't murder Lady Esther, but you feared being blamed for it. Now, let's start from the beginning. Tell me everything." Her shoulders sagged. The walls she had so carefully built around herself crumbled in an instant. She sank into the divan, trembling, and covered her face with shaking hands. The confession spilled out of her in rushed, broken words. "I have to start from the beginning," she whispered. "I was afraid of her. She wasn't mad, not really. But she was strange. She brought me here, you see. I thought it was romantic, exciting. I was a fool." Her voice wavered as she spoke. "There was this thing with a chauffeur back in England. She was obsessed with him. But he didn't want her. He humiliated her. People found out. They laughed at her behind her back. That's why she left. To save face." Her hands twisted in her lap. her breath coming in shallow bursts. She planned to go back, just for a little while, but she got worse. Out here she changed. She grew wilder. And then there was the pilot. Parker Pine waited for her to gather herself, sensing the storm that was coming. "Hercule?" he prompted gently. "Yes," she whispered, almost inaudible now. She fixated on him, but when he came to see me, not her, she faltered, swallowing hard, her face pale. She thought. Pine's voice was gentle but insistent. What did she think, Muriel? Her voice trembled, breaking with emotion. She turned on me. She said I was her slave, she called me, that she had power over me, life and death. Pine nodded slowly, the pieces falling into place. A young girl, trapped in the grip of a delusional woman, powerless against her twisted sense of authority. But one day, something inside me snapped, Muriel continued, her voice rising in a raw rush of guilt. I stood up to her. I told her I was stronger, that I'd throw her off the terrace if she didn't leave me alone. Tears welled in her eyes as she spoke the next words, almost in a whisper. She was frightened. She thought I meant it. She stepped back, too far. Muriel broke down completely, her sobs racking her body. Pine sat in silence, allowing the weight of her confession to settle in. Finally, when her sobs subsided, he spoke, his voice soft but firm. "You didn't murder her, Muriel. It's time to stop carrying this guilt, time to go home." Muriel's tear-streaked face slowly turned up to look at him, disbelief flickering in her eyes. For the first time, there was a glimmer of hope. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to this intriguing story narrated by Dr. Rami. If you enjoyed the suspense and the twists, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss out on more captivating tales from the Curious Case channel. And hey, don't forget to leave a comment below. Tell us what you think, or share your theories about the mystery. We love hearing from you. Stay curious.